Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Seerah Mastermind, Episode 7, The Demise of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. In the previous episode, we learnt that how in the 6th year after Hijrah, the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam saw a dream in which he and his companions were circling the Kaaba. He consequently travelled to Mecca to perform the Umrah pilgrimage and stopped at Hudaybiyah. A messenger was sent to inform the Quraysh that the Muslims had come for Umrah, but he was attacked and his camel killed, so Uthman radiallahu anhu was sent. Later progress was being made until Suhail radiallahu anhu, who later became a Muslim, arrived and made an agreement which later became known as a treaty or the agreement of Hudaybiyah, and which Allah referred to as Fatham Mubina, a clear victory. This agreement said that the Muslims could live in peace but could not perform Umrah that year. Although the terms of the deal were completely unfair, the Prophet ﷺ agreed to them all because ultimately it allowed the Muslims to live in peace and spread Islam without risk of attack or injury. The Prophet ﷺ then sent letters to world leaders inviting them to Islam, including the ruler of the Roman Empire, Heraclius, and the emperor of the Persian Empire, Khosroes. The next year, the Prophet ﷺ set out for Mecca again in order to perform the Umrah he was unable to do so previously. In the 8th year of Hijrah, the Quraysh broke the agreement, so the Prophet ﷺ marched on Mecca, and the conquest of Mecca occurred, in which 2,000 people became Muslim. Sa'ad bin Ubadah radiallahu anhu was singing, "Today is a day of slaughter," but the Prophet ﷺ told him, "No, today is a day of forgiveness and mercy." The Prophet ﷺ entered Mecca, went to the Kaaba, removed the idols in and around it, and cleaned the inside of the Kaaba. Finally, he returned to Medina. The Farewell Hajj. In the 10th year of Hijrah, the final year in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, when almost all of Arabia had converted and his goal of spreading the message of Allah far and wide had been achieved, the Prophet ﷺ travelled for Hajjatul Wida, which means his final and farewell Hajj. Joining him were over 100,000 Sahaba and companions who came from all parts of the country and gathered together in Mina to perform Hajj. The men were dressed in 2 white sheets, all equal in the eyes of Allah, all performing the same actions and all praying side by side, emphasizing that there is no race or class separation in Islam. Once the Prophet ﷺ returned to Medina, he lived for just 2 more months and then began his journey to return to his Creator. Signs of passing away. The first sign that it was time for the Prophet ﷺ to leave this temporary world was the revelation of Surah Nasr, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفر إنه كان توابا, which means when the help and success of Allah arrives and you see people entering the religion in droves, then praise and glorify your Lord and ask Him for forgiveness. Indeed, He is constantly forgiving. The Prophet ﷺ understood that Allah was telling him his goal of spreading Islam had been accomplished and that it was time to return to Allah. The second sign was that Jibreel ﷺ would visit the Prophet ﷺ every year and listen to the Prophet ﷺ recite the Quran once, from memory. That year, though, he listened to the Prophet ﷺ twice. The third sign was that the Prophet ﷺ would normally spend the last 10 days of Ramadan in itikaf in the mosque, engaged in prayer, dhikr and Quran recitation. But in that last Ramadan, the Prophet ﷺ spent an additional 10 days in itikaf. Other signs were the revelation of the verse أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا, which means, today I have perfected your religion for you and completed my favors upon you and chosen Islam to be your religion, which again indicated the Prophet ﷺ was going to pass away. Passing away. The beginning of Safar, the Prophet ﷺ went to the graves of the people who had died at Uhud. This was the first time in 8 years he had been there, and he stood at the graves and prayed for their forgiveness. Towards the end of the month of Safar, the Prophet ﷺ woke up late at night and headed to the graveyard of Baqi in Medina. I have been ordered to seek forgiveness for the people of Jannatul Baqi, he he said. On his return, he fell ill with a headache and flu. The headache and illness continued on and off for 7 days. The Prophet ﷺ then fell worse and began staying at the house of his wife Aisha radiallahu anha, since her house was right next to the mosque and even had a door leading into the mosque. Speaking to Fatima radiallahu anha. During the illness, the Prophet ﷺ called his last surviving child, Fatima radiallahu anha, and whispered something in her ear. She cried, and then he whispered something again, and then she smiled. When Aisha radiallahu anha asked what the Prophet ﷺ had said, Fatima radiallahu anha told her the first time the Prophet ﷺ hinted to that he was going to pass away. So I cried. Then he told me I would be the first person from his family to join him, so I smiled. 4 days before. 4 days before his death, the Prophet ﷺ felt his condition improving. Although he wasn't able to walk to the mosque himself, he still went, supporting himself on the shoulders of his cousin Ali radiallahu anhu and his uncle Abbas radiallahu anhu. He led the Muslims in Dhuhr prayer and then spoke to everyone about kindness and forgiveness. O people, he said, Allah gave a servant of his a choice between the bounties of this world or the bounties of the hereafter. The servant chose the bounties of the hereafter. At this, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu began sobbing uncontrollably. No one could understand why, but Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was the only one who realized that the Prophet ﷺ was talking about himself. He was the slave, and he had chosen to return to Allah. The Prophet ﷺ was going to pass away. The Prophet ﷺ then ordered all the private doors opening into the mosque should be sealed, except the door of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's house. I have repaid the favors of everyone except Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he said. Only Allah will repay him for all the help that he has given to me. The Prophet ﷺ then spoke about the certainty of death and the importance of being productive. He recited Surah Asr and told the Sahabas to make good use of their time by performing good deeds, helping each other and being patient. The last prayer. The last salah the Prophet ﷺ led was a Maghrib prayer, in which he prayed Surah Al-Mursalat. At Isha time, he tried to stand up, but he was too weak to do so. 2 or 3 times he tried to stand, but each time he collapsed and was unable to walk. Eventually he said, "Instruct Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu to lead the Isha prayer." Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu then led Isha and the rest of the prayers from then onwards, in place of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. 2 or 3 days later, on Saturday or Sunday, the Prophet ﷺ felt a bit better. With the help of Ali radiallahu anhu and Abbas radiallahu anhu, he put his arms around their shoulders and they carried him to the mosque. The Prophet ﷺ was so weak that he could barely walk or speak. The prayer had already started when Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu realized that the Prophet ﷺ was coming. He stepped back a bit, so the Prophet ﷺ was now leading the prayer sitting down, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was following the Prophet ﷺ. However, the Prophet ﷺ's voice was so faint and weak that only Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu could hear him. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu would call out the takbirs for the changes in salam, so that everyone else knew what to do. This was the last time the Prophet ﷺ entered the mosque. Death. On the Monday, at Fajr time, while the Sahabas were in prayer, the Prophet ﷺ slightly pulled aside the curtain that was covering the door to his home and peeked in at the Sahabas in prayer. He smiled, pleased at the calmness, serenity and unity he was seeing. This was the last time he saw the companions in prayer. A little while later, the Prophet ﷺ's condition worsened. Abdurrahman, the son of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, walked into the room with a miswak in his hand. The Prophet ﷺ looked at it longingly, unable to say or do anything because he was so weak. Aisha radiallahu anha understood the Prophet ﷺ wanted to use a miswak. She got a fresh one, softened it with her teeth, and then used a miswak to brush the Prophet ﷺ's teeth. The Prophet ﷺ had some water by his side. He would dip his hand into the water and pass it over his face, ever so slowly. He did this one last time, then looked up at the sky. The angels had arrived. Allahumma bir Rafiq al-A'la. O Allah, with the highest companions, said the Prophet ﷺ. And then his hand dropped and everything was silent. The Prophet ﷺ, the greatest man to step foot on this earth, had passed away. Jazakallahu khair for listening. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase the knowledge and the love we have for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Next time on Seerah Mastermind, the quiz. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.